Live from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York, I'm Shonali Bassett.
And I'm Tim Stenivek. Welcome to Bloomberg Crypto. It's a look at the people, transactions, and technology shaping the world of decentralized finance.
And Bitcoin turning around a bit in today's session, now in the green, but it's still failing to crack the $100,000 mark.
No matter the price, MicroStrategy's Michael Saylor, well, he just keeps buying. We give you the latest details.
And the crypto community gets what it always wanted. Gary Gensler is set to depart the SEC after tense legal battles with companies.
That's all ahead over the next half hour on Bloomberg Crypto. First, though, a snapshot of the market. As Shonali said, now we are in the green, still so close to reaching $100,000 last Friday. It came within $300 that day. Since then, well, Bitcoin has come down. Some of that euphoria has come off. Bitcoin down about 5% since Friday, though, up close to 2% today, $94,000 per Bitcoin. Now some traders are actually betting on a further decline of the crypto. This chart actually shows flows for the ProShares Ultra Short Bitcoin ETF. It looks to deliver twice the inverse daily performance of Bitcoin. Look at this net inflow right here. It recorded $18.8 million on Monday. It's the largest since its launch back in April.
Incredible to see these capital markets evolving, because now you can, of course, bet for or against through ETFs as well as options. But here's a play in the equity market in MicroStrategy. Remember, this has been a leveraged Bitcoin play that has been bullish, and MicroStrategy, as you can see, remains bullish. The firm bought another $5.4 billion in Bitcoin last week, bringing its total stockpile to around $38 billion in Bitcoin. Tim, if you're looking at this, some people say, great, they're so bullish, let's buy more MicroStrategy. But others say, listen, this is a finite amount of Bitcoin. Why have it all in one place? And why borrow to have more of it? Very controversial. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the show.
That leveraged bet on Bitcoin. Can count on that from Michael Saylor. Hey, last week, Binance CEO Richard Tang told Bloomberg that 2024 clearly a winning year for crypto.
Well, President Trump being elected certainly give a boost and give greater clarity to this. But I will say that 2024 has been a landmark year, and that momentum started earlier this year. So if you look at what happened in January this year with Bitcoin ETF being approved, firstly in the United States and then subsequently all around the world, from Brazil to Canada to Australia, Hong Kong, and the list goes on. It gives a lot of recognition and finally the respect that this sector deserved all along.
We're going to talk about what comes next with Bloomberg's Emily Grafeo, because there's kind of a lot going on. There's a lot of excitement because not only did you recently have the trading of those options around the spot Bitcoin ETF, but you also have now Gary Gensler with the idea of not only him stepping down, but a new SEC chair, a set of new filings, new types of assets that you could see traded on a spot basis in the ETF world. What are you watching the most?
So one of the biggest themes that a lot of people in the crypto and both ETF community are talking about is just without Gensler, how many more altcoins are we going to see in ETFs? So we have a spot Bitcoin ETF, we have a spot Ether ETF, we have filings for XRP, Litecoin, and Solana in an ETF. And so although those were filed under a Gensler administration, the talk now is that it's going to be way more likely to be approved if we have someone else helming the SEC. And then the question now is what else could be put into an ETF? Could we see MakerDAO's coin put into a spot ETF? I've heard that one kind of pitched. And then not only altcoins, but could we see technical analysis applied to a Bitcoin ETF? Actively managed Bitcoin ETFs, ones that combine more derivatives and the spot prices. People are just trying to imagine that Wall Street is just going to really try and commoditize the boom in crypto now.
I guess I wonder if there's actually demand for all of these different products out there. We certainly see that for the spot Bitcoin ETFs, no question. Certainly spot Ether at this point, though less demand than we see for Bitcoin. Is the market just going to say essentially, okay, well, these are the ones that we believe in, not necessarily these other ones?
It's a good question. Also, when we're talking about altcoins, a lot of the kinds of traders, retail traders who want to trade things like an XRP token probably don't need an ETF to do so. But nevertheless, that isn't stopping Wall Street and ETF issuers from trying to squeeze out, any last expense ratio, even though these products only cost like 0.5%. It doesn't stop people from talking about all of these filings, but it's a good question. I mean, I did speak to one ETF model portfolio manager. He runs different portfolios. He was saying that he he'd probably put a spot Bitcoin ETF into his portfolio, and he'd consider something that had a little bit more active management because he's from TradFi. He doesn't really know how to apply that in his portfolio.
You are certainly making Bitcoin look much more mainstream when you're talking about MakerDAO in the form of an ETF. That is a decentralized, autonomous organization. One of the first. Certainly would be interesting to see that financialized. We'll see what comes. Bloomberg's Emily Griffeo, we thank you so much for all of your reporting. We're going to now bring in Crucible Capital general partner Meltem Demirors. So, riddle me this. I mean, if you had all of MakerDAO in particular really stuns me because you had all of these kind of projects come up with the idea of bucking the Wall Street trend. Is everyone just now caving in?
I still think quality matters, brand name matters. If we look at crypto's market cap today, Bitcoin has 56% dominance. In the past, Bitcoin dominance has been, as low as 40%. We're now nearing a 4-year high in terms of Bitcoin's dominance. It's 56% of the crypto market. If we look at ETF AUM, we have 130 billion in Bitcoin ETFs, and we have a fraction of that, I think around 14 billion in Ethereum ETFs. The demand is there for Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin has earned its place in the pantheon of institutional grade investments. So I would say I'm going to hold my horses on the institutionalization of the long tail of crypto. This right now, I think, is still very much on the institutional side, a Bitcoin story, maybe an Ether story. And obviously, we're seeing a lot of enthusiasm around Solana as well.
I'm really interested about MicroStrategy as well. If we're talking about Bitcoin, what about the environment around Bitcoin? You have prominent investors like venture capitalist Jason Calacanis raising more and more red flags on Twitter, really criticizing the idea of buying more Bitcoin with leverage and asking an honest question he posed, I believe, in the last 24 hours here. If you love Bitcoin, why wouldn't you just sell your MicroStrategy and buy Bitcoin directly and get 2 for 1 and control your keys? You could ask the same thing about a lot of these other Bitcoin-related products, couldn't you?
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, Shonali, what Jason is not taking into account here is not all investors are the same. There are many different types of investors. Let's not forget MicroStrategy, right? Last week traded almost as much volume on their options and spot book as the entire UK stock market, more than the Mag 7, right? MicroStrategy has a very deep options book. And until the launch of the spot Bitcoin short that recently, the ETF short that was recently launched, there was really no good way to trade options around Bitcoin. People like levered strategies as well. MicroStrategy, right, is a levered play on Bitcoin. So for institutional investors who maybe don't want to buy an ETF or don't have a mandate to buy an ETF, buying MicroStrategy, having deep options book on MicroStrategy is really valuable. We have to remember that not all crypto buyers are the same. And with more and more institutional investors coming in, we're going to see different types of products and different types of investing strategies that cater to different investment mandates. And I'll just add, Schwab was very anti-Bitcoin. The CEO recently came out and said he feels silly for not buying Bitcoin. So Schwab's getting into the crypto game. And I'm keeping my eye on Vanguard. They're the second largest asset manager in the US. I'm really curious to see how they're going to enter the crypto game.
Yeah, I actually did that interview with Schwab CEO Rick Wurster last week out there in San Francisco at Schwab Impact, where he told us that. He still said, though, Meltem, he is not going to buy Bitcoin at this point. It's not the type of investment that he would actually put in his own portfolio. So what do you make of that?
It doesn't matter. He has a job, right? As an asset manager, as someone who runs financial services firm, you create products and services that cater to what your customers want. 28% of American adults own Bitcoin. That's a huge number. If they're begging you for a crypto product, if they're trading on every platform but yours, your fiduciary responsibility as an executive is to offer the products your customers want. So while I respect what he does in his PA, if you're an executive, right, your job is not to sell your PA, your job is to serve your customers. And I just think we're at a point, Bitcoin is not contrarian. Bitcoin is consensus. When I first started coming on this show, it was a career risk to be in Bitcoin. I've been doing it for a decade. It was a risk. Now I think it's a risk to not offer Bitcoin on your platform and to not hold Bitcoin in your portfolio as an allocator.
Meltem, we don't have a ton of time, but I do want to get your thoughts on what changes under the incoming Trump administration. We know the head of the SEC, that changes. But how did the Bitcoin story change with Trump's election?
I think everything changes, and here's why. I think the Trump administration has made it very, very clear Bitcoin is a strategic reserve asset. I think we're going to see an opening up of capital markets, and that's not just limited to Bitcoin. I think just broadly, the longer tail of assets, higher risk investments, whether that's venture, private equity, or crypto, is just perhaps going to see some changes in rulemaking, some changes in how the administration approaches those assets. And look, at the end of the day, we live in a very different world, more volatility everywhere. Crypto used to be the most volatile asset class. Like a few weeks ago, bonds were more volatile than crypto. So I just think we live in a very different world. And so everything has changed. Everything's going to continue to change. I think the next 4 years will be extremely interesting. And I'm really optimistic about this continued sort of viewpoint that Bitcoin is not contrarian anymore. It has proven its place as an asset class. Where the rest of crypto falls, that's going to be figured out. But it's not just one broad asset class.
Right.
There are many different categories. So we'll have to carve that out.
Meltem Demirors, Crucible Capital General Partner, joining us from New Hampshire. Really appreciate it. Well, coming up next on Bloomberg Crypto, we're going to stick with Trump's impact on the asset class. Georgetown's Chris Brummer joins us to talk about how Trump will impact adoption across the fintech landscape.
And FTX co-founder Gary Wang avoids prison time. We're going to bring you details on that next.
And access all of the latest data on and news on crypto, just check out CRYP Go on the terminal. This is Bloomberg.
We've been able to get policymakers to think about crypto on the merits, to look around the world and see that virtually every other G20 country is providing regulatory clarity in the space. And now we hope the U.S. will do the same. All we're looking for is clear rules, certainty, predictability, and an ability to build in the United States. And I think we're going to be able to get that.
That was Coinbase's chief policy officer earlier this month here on Bloomberg Crypto. And remember, President-elect Donald Trump is considering the first crypto role in the White House as SEC Chair Gary Gensler prepares to step down in January. Bloomberg's Stephanie Lai has been covering the transition appointments and joins us now from the White House. And you think about this flurry of change you're seeing down in Washington. Certainly, crypto had played a large part in the campaign, but how is it now going to be addressed at a much bigger scale, frankly, in the second Trump term? What types of people are being discussed for this crypto role?
A lot of the names that we're hearing for potential SEC chairs are also being floated for this potential crypto czar position. There's a lot of interest among the industry to have a player who knows both how Washington works and how the industry is hoping to build out its goals moving forward. And so the Trump campaign had spent many, many months trying to lobby for the crypto industry to support the campaign. And for a while, it was a question of whether or not Donald Trump would actually follow through with many of the promises he was making. But this idea of having a crypto czar to be able to work with both the SEC, CFTC, Capitol Hill, and the players in the industry, this is really a sign that the campaign and the next administration is taking this very seriously.
But it's also a sign that he can kind of handpick somebody who doesn't necessarily have to be approved by the Senate, because this would be a role, like a czar type role, that wouldn't require Senate confirmation. Stephanie, correct?
Correct. And so this is actually something he's been doing a lot with his transition picks. There are a handful of people who didn't necessarily have the desire to enter through a Senate confirmation role. For instance, Elon Musk serving as sort of this advisor, working on Doge. These sorts of positions enable Trump to pick people who he thinks will be able to help oversee his agenda, but not necessarily need to go through all those strict rules like, divesting, having financial disclosures, some of those issues. But it's not entirely clear yet if that will apply for this crypto czar role.
All right, Bloomberg's Stephanie Lai joining us from the White House. Let's discuss now Gary Gensler's decision to step down with Georgetown professor and DC FinTech Week founder Chris Brummer, who is back with us from Washington, D.C. Chris, I do want to start with this idea of a crypto czar in the White House. How do you look at a role like this and the relationship that this person would have with the SEC, with the crypto industry, but also making sure that, hey, this is an industry where I think a lot of critics would say consumers still need to be protected?
Yeah, I think that when you talk about things like clarity and the desire to bring clarity, you have to really define what that means here in Washington. On the one hand, it means what are the substantive rules, and that's where you have things like a crypto czar to ideally help coordinate across the government. But it also means, how do you comply with those rules? And I think that what you're going to see, both coming from the SEC or coming from a crypto czar, and certainly even coordination from the Treasury Department, is this question of how do we make rules that are fit for purpose, and then how exactly are those companies going to ultimately comply with those rules for the ongoing future?
So speaking of rules of the future, it's not like in the last Trump administration there were no rules, right? I mean, you actually had some fairly critical approaches to some parts of the crypto industry. And when you look at the way crypto has been behaving, yes, there's Bitcoin on one hand, but then there's all of this optimism on, for example, this idea that altcoins will be almost en masse being approved to be rolled up into ETF wrappers. Do you think that this exuberance is maybe going a little too far, given what we've seen in the past?
As I said, I think people get a little bit confused about what clarity means. I think that you heard this from the Coinbase comments earlier, is that what the industry has thus far advocated is clear rules of the road. I mean, certainly the SEC didn't engender a lot of friends by pursuing enforcement actions where there wasn't a lot of clarity as to how to make fit for purpose rules. But there are rules, and those rules will be in place. Generally, we tend to think about things like AML and KYC issues that will certainly continue to predominate the national conversation. But there is also an entire world, an entire ambit of things that firms are going to have to think about in the near future, including operational rules. Over at my company, Blueprint, we think about disclosure rules that really companies are going to have to think about if they want to remain on the right side of even the Trump administration.
Chris, I got to ask you, we haven't had a chance to speak since the election, but one of the reasons that I think a lot of people have said that Bitcoin has moved higher is because the optimism around a strategic Bitcoin reserve being established here in the U.S. Do you think that's something that happens? And if yes, how do you think the government will convince the American people that that's a good use of money?
Well, I am a law professor and not necessarily a political strategist, but I think that what you're bringing up is this very important question as to why a Bitcoin reserve and how it would actually be operationalized. And I think there are still a lot of questions, even in the market, as to sort of what it means for market players, for long-term holders of Bitcoin, and what does it mean for the newcomers, and what does it mean for the mainstreaming of the market. I think that what you're seeing, though, from the president-elect is an expression of enthusiasm for the market, and that's got to be helpful, along with a vision of at least trying to mainstream at least some of the more traditional, or at least as in the prior segment, the big brand names, certainly in the crypto asset space. And I think that that's really what this conversation is about, although there will be some very real technical conversations later down the road.
Certainly just the beginning. Chris Brummer, we thank you so very much for joining us today over at Georgetown. Now, coming up next, why Sam Bankman-Fried's business partner Gary Wang will not serve prison time in the FTX case, plus the legal environment as Trump enters the White House. We're going to expand a little more on that. This is Bloomberg.
FTX co-founder Gary Wang will not serve prison time after prosecutors praised his early cooperation in the fraud case that led to the sentencing of Sam Bankman-Fried. Bloomberg's Benny-Morrison is at the Southern District of New York courthouse. Ava, good to see you. I want to step back and just talk big picture here with the changing view of regulation in Washington, D.C., and the conversation, too, about investor protections and what that means in a new administration. As a legal reporter who covered the FTX trial and knows people who are intricately involved in this, how do you look at the changing regime in Washington when it comes to crypto?
It's interesting because we're just coming out of the end of this slew of prosecutions that happened after what we call the crypto winter. There are a lot of exchanges, founders who were prosecuted in this very district, and the SEC and the DOJ took what was largely seen as a very aggressive approach to prosecuting not only fraud, but different kind of regulatory violations as well. Trump has made no secret that he is much more of a friend to the crypto industry. So we're expecting to see, less of kind of those periphery cases in the crypto industry, that kind of regulatory violations, Bank Secrecy Act violations. But from the people that I've spoken to, career prosecutors, former prosecutors, they believe that the straight out fraud, the FTXs of the world will continue to be prosecuted.
One thing that has been fascinating about watching your coverage of the prosecution is the role that even people inside of FTX had played. You wrote this story about Gary, about how he had really built a lot of tools via software, technology tools that really helped the government here find out what was wrong in the first place. How does this really change the game for financial crime moving forward? If so much of this is done online and so much of this has just a really few number of people holding the keys to the castle, how does that make a prosecutor's job more difficult?
It certainly makes it more difficult when you have people with an extraordinary skill set like Gary Wang did, and the prosecutors even pointed that out. And they compared the code that Gary was creating at FTX to Sanskrit. So they're constantly having to upskill and having to become experts themselves in this kind of technology. For Gary, in his case, it certainly worked in his favor and helped him prove that he should get a lot of credit for the amount of cooperation that he has given to the government. I think he is an exception to the norm. You don't see many defendants who offer to build fraud detection software for the government, but he certainly set a high bar for the people that will come after him.
Coming out kind of like a modern day Frank Abagnale, isn't he, Tim?
I guess you could say that. Is that it for FTX?
Pretty close,
yeah.
I'm certain. Ava, we have to leave it there. We thank you so much for your time and are very excited about all of your coverage moving forward. And that does it for us for Bloomberg Crypto. We did not hit, Tim, that $100,000 mark. We're actually pretty far below it at this point.
One guarantee, there's going to be that guy at Thanksgiving who's going to talk to you about Bitcoin.
Oh, there sure is.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it actually won't be a guy. I'm sure it will be my mother. But until then, happy Thanksgiving. Same time, same place next week. This is Bloomberg.